So I want to make sure that everybody's like comfortable. My name is Robert Wendt. I'm a career counselor here. I work with our WorkAbility program. I've worked as a ADA personnel analyst and actually many other positions that deal with disability over the years. The Career Development Center has a program called WorkAbility 4. And WorkAbility 4 is designed to assist clients of the Department of Rehabilitation secure internships and or employment related to their career goals. We have counselors on staff that can help with, your career issues, your resume writing, your job search, your interview preparation, and then just overall anything that kind of relates to your career that relates to that goal in your plan can be talked over with that career counselor. And that includes things like disclosing your disability or asking for accommodations or helping identify what accommodations are best for your disability based on your own personal needs. So basically what we're going to do is hopefully help you understand that disclosure process, give you resources, and hopefully disclosure from beginning to end. That's the intent, is for you to kind of understand, okay, here's identifying things you need, identifying how to communicate with your employer, how and when to communicate with your employer, and then how to follow up with that situation. Okay, let's go ahead and go on. So disability disclosure is when a job applicant or employer shares specific personal information about their disability. So that's basically it. It's that simple a definition. But notice that it says that, the employee shares the specific information. And notice it says they share it. So they can choose to share or not share. One of the things we'll talk about is invisible versus visible disabilities, right? So if you have an invisible disability, you may be able to go much further through the process without disclosing. But if you happen to have a disability yourself, I do, my disability is such that parts of it are revealed during the interview process. So I can't hide it. And I'll kind of share a personal story later on about how I do that, but I can't hide my disability from an employer. I can say it doesn't exist, but they're going to see something and it's going to make them wonder. So we'll also then move on to requesting like what job accommodations are necessary, getting the benefits and privileges of that employment based in the accommodation that will allow you to perform at an equal level. And then explaining unusual circumstances. And so we'll give a few examples as we walk through this process. Let's go ahead and go on. So a couple of myths. Applicants must disclose their disability during hiring. No, that is absolutely not true. And I'll give you some more explanation. Employees cannot request accommodations later if they don't disclose initially. We'll talk about that. And then I don't need to share information about my individual condition to receive an accommodation. My personal medical information is private. And we'll talk about that. Let's go ahead and move on. I think something got out of place there. So you're not required to disclose disability during hiring unless accommodation is needed during the hiring process. So if you have a visual impairment and they're giving you some visual task to do, you might choose to disclose because you're not going to be able to perform that task sufficiently to get past the interview process. If you have trouble with communications and verbal communication and you're, it's going to be problematic in the interview. Obviously, that's something that may need disclosure or an accommodation to accomplish the interview. You don't have to tell the employer that the accommodation will be needed for the job if hired. Now, that's also true. You don't have to tell them. But again, it's your choice, and you've already kind of played some of your cards by doing that during the interview process, or the hiring process, I should say, the onboarding. So you have to kind of make choices then, because otherwise you're going to leave them in the dark, which is your choice. But they may also make assumptions based on the information that they do have. Employees may disclose a disability request accommodation at any time. So even if you've been there 10 years and you're starting to see maybe they change a system or something like that, and you're no longer able to perform in the same way, then you may choose to ask for an accommodation at that point. So it can be from, minute one all the way up until the, last couple of days you work, you can ask for accommodation. When the disability or need for accommodation is not known or obvious, so primarily invisible disability, an employer may request reasonable medical information to provide an accommodation. So this is a real tricky area. It can require some disclosure, but I've seen letters that didn't disclose as much about the specific disability, but just expose the accommodations needed. So there's kind of a mixed bag of things there, but for the most part, the letter is about the accommodations. The letter is from a professional that says, hey, this person has a disability that requires the following accommodations. They may or may not choose to disclose it, or you may or may not choose to disclose the disability. If it is helpful to disclose it, you may want to. One thing I might add, though, is people have this kind of psychological need to catastrophize when they hear a disability. And they always think of it, I shouldn't say always, many times they think of it in its kind of the worst case scenario. So you have to make a choice there, how you want to disclose. To that end, I will tell you about my disability situation. I have a visual impairment, and I will often, because my eyes aren't cosmetically aligned, sometimes people will assume I can't see out of one eye or whatever else they assume. And so I often will open my interview with, hey, I have a visual impairment, but it's allowed me to do, I've been able to do these jobs and do these things. If you have questions during the interview that relate to my ability to do the job, feel free to ask. And then I just move on from there. My theory behind it is I have enough experience and/or knowledge to be able to compensate for anything that they might be thinking. Let's go on. Okay. And we just talked about this. So clarifying the truth, right? Disclosure is not required during hiring unless accommodation is needed, and employees can request accommodations at any time. I keep messing that word up. It's driving me nuts. So anytime. Let's go ahead and go on. Basically anytime, right? There's no such thing as too soon, too late, it's really based in the need that you may have. You may find that you can accommodate your disability independently and don't need to disclose, but, and I don't think it's in the slides. I should have put it in here. If you don't disclose, you don't have the protections that might protect you as a situation. That's the only negative of not disclosing if you choose not to. But again, it's your personal choice. I always advise people to, make the choice wisely. I've very few people have I ever worked with that I said, well, I absolutely think you should disclose. I may say, well, what are the problems that are being presented? And do you think it has to do with accommodation? And so I'll get there, but I usually go through a questioning route to get there. Let's go ahead and go on. Okay, so how you want to disclose? There's a lot of ways. You can say something like, some sort of adjustment is needed due to a medical condition or disability. You can request an accommodation from someone who can act on the request. So that's an important part. So it's two pieces, right? Is letting them know what you need and then contacting the proper person in the office. So this gets a little funny. You can go directly to your supervisor if you want. You don't have to, though. You can go to HR, and HR can tell your supervisor this employee needs these accommodations, and your supervisor doesn't necessarily need to know what your disability is. So you can choose to go that route. So this is one fine area of the law that you have to be really careful about, because if you want to protect yourself, I would go HR, because they just come back to the employer and say, hey, this person needs these accommodations. How can we work it out? And basically the whole process is negotiation anyway. You may request something that's impossible for them to do for some reason. Okay. Because it does, accommodations are based on the organization's ability to afford the accommodations, um, based financially and in their regular business operations. So let's go ahead and go on. So I would never disclose to everyone. I wouldn't do it. I mean, if you've been there 10 years and do it, fine. That's, your choice. Because people are probably going to see issues. But again, it's your choice. You can stay silent your whole time, just talk to each other. And they're the only ones that know everything. And by the way, this information is kept in a separate file. It's not even kept in your personnel file. So if your supervisor goes to look at your personnel file, they won't see the doctor's letter. They won't see any of that, because this information is supposed to be kept separate. Although your supervisor, if you feel close enough and you've established a strong rapport with your supervisor, I don't know that it's a bad idea for them to know. And it's your choice. Go ahead and go on. So here's the situation. Rhonda has depression and needs to ask for the accommodation of a flexible schedule while she adjusts to new medication. She's having difficulty sleeping and waking up and has been late 3 days in a row. She is wary of disclosing her medical condition, but is concerned about disciplinary action. This is a really important point, by the way, is if you continue to make errors or mistakes or whatever related to your disability, it can be very detrimental to your position. And you may recover from it, but you may not always recover from the impression that you leave from your errors or mistakes or whatever, is going on that's negative. So it's kind of a workplace issue in terms of, this may be, in this particular situation, disclosing early is probably a good idea, because obviously absences or tardiness are usually really important to most employers. So it's something that you would want to probably disclose early. And again, it depends on what's happening. Depends on what's happening. Okay, so, okay, let's go to the next slide. So Rhonda discloses and provides medical documentation. Since her work doesn't depend on or affect others, the employer found no hardship. Notice I said hardship. the term is undue hardship, right? So they found no hardship in flexing Rhonda's schedule as long as she works between the core business hours of 8 to 6 p.m. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember is that um, businesses do have a little bit of wiggle room here. But when you talk about costs, so let's say you work for Amazon and the Amazon warehouse you're at in its individual budget can't afford whatever your accommodation is. Well, that's not a way out for them because the courts look at the entirety of the company's budget. They don't just look at a facility's budget. So you have a little bit of wiggle room there in terms of requesting an accommodation. And for the most part, just to be honest with you, most accommodations are under what, $500. They're not that expensive for the most part because they are things like this, changing a schedule or swapping a duty between two employees or, that kind of thing that doesn't really cost the company money. The work is still getting done at the same level. They just, made a few adjustments to the position. Let's go ahead and go on. Okay, so this is all under Title I of the AD, which is the employment title. And there's a public and government service title, and so there's different titles. But in general, the employment title talks about the unlawful discrimination. It typically is a private employer of 15 or more employees, state and local government employer of 15 or more employees, an employment agency. Okay, so if you go for temp help, technically they're supposed to be under the law, labor organization or labor management committee. So anybody who kind of controls employment in some way has obligations under this act. The Rehab Act is old history, but the Rehab Act of 1973 has Section 501, which has been changed somewhat, but it basically applies to executive agencies of the U.S. government. So that is basically any of the department ofs and the president's offices related to the federal government. And then there's a couple of resources there. Let's go ahead and go on. Okay. So this talks about the definition, right? Is who is disabled, right? So it's a person who has or has a history of having had a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits or limited a major life activity, such as hearing, seeing, walking, lifting, breathing, performing manual tasks, learning. Okay, so just kind of in general, anything that is required for you to kind of live, if it's affected, it typically will fall in this category. Now, there are some exceptions to temporary things. There are some exceptions, and they're covered under other laws often, but lifelong disabilities tend to be covered. So it also has to satisfy the employer's requirements for the job. So this is important. You must be qualified by experience, education, skills, licenses, whatever. So you have to be qualified for the position for them to have to provide what you want. So keep that in mind. And then you can perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. So if the job requires you to drive and you're like me, I am legally blind, I'm not driving anytime soon. So for me, although I must say there are legally blind people driving, just so you know, for me, I don't have a driver's license. And so if I applied for a job and it required it, I wouldn't be able to even apply for the job because that's a requirement of the job. Okay. Now, there's a whole bunch of legal stuff behind that. So let's say it's something that's only done like 2 or 3 times a year. You could, in the application process, push that issue and say, hey, can we figure out some accommodation for this? Maybe I'll pay for it myself. I'll take a Lyft vehicle wherever I have to go or whatever. You could compensate for something that, even though it's an essential function, you need to be able to do it to do these parts of the job. If it doesn't recur on a super frequent basis, you may have some grounds for requesting an accommodation. Okay, let's go on. But again, it's very individual. It's extremely individual. So a reasonable accommodation, that's an adjustment to a job or a work environment that permits an applicant or employee with a disability to participate in the hiring process, perform the essential functions of job, or employ equal benefits and privileges of employment. And then reasonable means feasible or plausible. So possible to provide without causing the employer undue hardship. Undue hardship is an action requiring significant difficulty or expense, unduly costly, extensive, substantial, or disruptive, or would fundamentally alter the nature or operation of the business. So when you're requesting things, they have to kind of be covered under this section of the law. I would not, though, encourage anybody not to make that decision yourself. Go ahead and request it and let the employer identify whether it's a reasonable accommodation or not. Because you don't know what the employer is going to do. So don't make the decision yourself. Ask for what you think is necessary for you to do the job, and let that kind of work its way through the system. Okay. So ADA accommodation requests. Any request by an applicant or an employee for an adjustment or change for a reason related to a medical condition is an ADA accommodation request. Okay, so let's see. I'm having difficulty concentrating because of the side effects of new medication. That is a situation, right? My wheelchair won't fit under my desk. That's a situation. Healthcare provider's note states employee needs 3 months of leave for medical treatment. This actually is one of those things that kind of gets covered under two different laws potentially. So it's still something that you want to request and see if it's doable. Now, you don't always get to return if you are out for extended periods of time due to disability. Oftentimes, you may not always get to return to your exact position. You can return to the type of position, but you don't always return to the exact type of position. I need to go to counseling appointments once a week, so I need to leave early on those days. Okay, so that's a potentially reasonable accommodation based on the needs of the company. Now, do they have to pay you for that hour? No, you're taking leave. You're leaving for an hour. You don't, now if you're under some benefit program or whatever that pays, great, but there's no obligation. Next. Okay, this is important. Accommodation should be explored case by case. If somebody else is legally blind goes to have my job and do the same thing, their accommodations may be significantly different than mine. Even though our visual numbers and everything, maybe even the eye condition is identical, there's enough variation, and those of you in the crowd that have disabilities know this, there's enough variation in disability for one person to have adapted under certain circumstances where another may not. So I may ask for a totally set of different accommodations than my coworker who has an identical condition. There's no list anywhere of reasonable accommodations. The Job Accommodation Network has quite a bit of information, and it was established to actually provide support for employers and it's employees and employers. And it's come along over the years to back up the ADA along with there are regional centers that provide ADA technical support, and those technical support centers also talk about accommodations. And oftentimes they'll end up referring people to JAN, which is the Job Accommodation Network. The employer decides what is reasonable and has the right to choose among effective accommodation solutions. Now, this gets a little dicey. So I'll give you a blind example because it'll fit for everybody. If my employer says, hey, I can't afford a certain piece of software, and they say, but we know this other software does the same thing. As long as they're allow you the learning curve, if there is one, they can say, hey, you will use this piece of software instead. So the employer does have a little bit of oomph in terms of what accommodations they can and cannot. You may not get exactly what you request, right? So you request that your desk be raised if you're in a wheelchair to 32 inches. The employer may raise it 32 and a half inches. And, that may be something you have to live with as long as it's reasonable. And again, all these terms I'm using, reasonable, this, that, those are terms that have been defined by the courts. So they're pretty well defined right now. And then preference of applicant or employee should be given primary consideration when possible. So that's also a codicil here, right? Whatever you request that's specific to you, okay, starting from that other slide, it's preferable. And the law will look at it as preferable because you know what works for you. Okay, next. So some examples. So making existing facilities accessible and usable, right? So appropriate door handles, ramps, widened doorways, widened walkways, accessible restrooms. Okay, having appropriate signage that's readable from a distance by people with vision problems and or even other learning problems that require attention to print. Job restructuring. So this is like basically looking at the job and saying, okay, 10% of your job is calling customers, but let's say you have speech communication issues, right? That might be annoying to the company's customers for some reason. Then what can happen is the employer can say, well, look, we'll take that 10% away. We'll give it to somebody else. But what you're going to have to do is 10% of their billing process or whatever, right? So they will restructure your job so that you can swap out things or change things or increase one of the things you do and decrease that one thing, and it'll be given to somebody else. So work schedules are one of the big areas that can be adapted. Many people take medications that cause them to have sleep issues in the morning or sleep issues in the afternoon. And so employers may move your schedule around if it works within their regular business hours of operation. And that's an important factor. So if the company's open till 6 o'clock and you ask to stay until 7, the company doesn't have to let you stay till after 7. Okay. I mean, if you have a key and you can get in and out and they want to let you, fine. That's their choice, but they don't have to because it's not their regular business operating hours. Modifying a policy. So anything that, is requires an action by the employee that may be prohibited by their disability, then the company can modify a policy either on a blanket basis for all employees or as a special dispensation for that individual employee. Modifying equipment or acquiring equipment that's appropriate. Telework when possible. Certain disabilities, telework is a better choice. Sometimes those of you with disabilities, may be aware of paratransit. Paratransit is terribly unreliable, and people have to get up 3 hours before work. If they live 15, 20 miles away, you may have to get your ride 3 hours before you need to be there, just to be there on time, right? So if you're doing this at the end of the day, beginning of the day, that's 6 hours plus 9 hours if you get an hour lunch. So you're already spending 15 hours of your day. That's kind of onerous. So you may request telework. You may say, hey, how much of my work can I do at home? Or can I do all of it at home? Or can I come in for part of a day? That kind of thing. Providing a reader, interpreter, or job coach. Okay, that's perfectly within reason. Access of service or emotional support animal. Okay, so this is a real highly technical area, right? Emotional support animals and service animals. Service animals are definitely able to go pretty much anywhere with the person. It's like having a cane. It's like having a, pair of glasses. It's, the dog is basically a tool, or the service animal is a tool to help the person perform whatever duties they need to perform. Emotional support animals are provided for support in psychological situations, that kind of thing. There are some crazy legal things about where emotional support animals can go and can't go. So it's an interesting sort of thing for them to put in here. But for the most part, if the animal's under control and is trained and all that kind of stuff, there's no reason why an animal can't go where the human goes. And so the company has an obligation to allow that to happen. Let's go on to the next slide. Oops. Okay, so here's a potential sample letter. I will go ahead and read it real quick. I've been having medical issues that have affected my mood, sleep schedule, concentration, and focus. I would like to request accommodations so that I might be able to perform my job effectively before my performance starts to suffer. So notice this person is already noticing it's causing problems at work. And before somebody says anything to them, they're being proactive. Workplace distractions interfere with my concentration and focus. So I would like to try noise canceling headphones to minimize sound distractions. In addition, having a list of what I might need to do for the workday or week could also help me keep track of my work. Please let me know if you need additional information or would like to discuss additional ideas. Would you please let me know in the next week? Thank you for considering my request. So there's several characteristics here. The person defined the problem by saying what was happening. They proposed a solution. It's always a good idea to propose a solution. Okay, some of this stuff you do know because you may do accommodations for classes and that kind of thing. So you know that some of those accommodations are going to be similar in the workplace. And then when they wrote the letter, they requested a time frame to be responded to. And that's important because if a company drags its feet, you have nothing to go on. But if you've written a letter with sort of a time frame in it, I usually go 2 weeks unless I know whatever's so severe that it needs to be addressed immediately. So if it's something that can wait, I will usually give people 2 weeks. That seems to be a common legal period, but I'm not a lawyer, but it's just what I've seen over the years. Okay, next slide. Okay, so your documentation, it can come from a medical doctor, psychiatrist, or psychologist, or any licensed psychotherapist can also do it. physician's assistant or nurse, physical occupational therapist, speech therapist, vocational rehabilitation professional, licensed mental health professional, that's what I was mentioning earlier, or an educational professional who has knowledge of disability. Okay, so that's kind of those are your people that can write you a letter referencing your need for accommodations. So you have a kind of a broad area here. So resources, general ADA employment rights. It's important and I really encourage you to email me and I will send the slides to you. It's important for you to read this information and understand it. Don't wait until just before you get the job, because if you have questions, then you're going to have to be searching around for answers and that kind of thing. So all of these links in here go to Job Accommodation Network primarily. And that's fine. That's a starting point. But you can also use these kind of titles to Google information. The federal government has a whole site on the ADA with tons of information too. And then the technical assistance centers also have lots of information on their websites. So there's a bunch of sources for this information. And even the Jan website will refer you to other sites and that kind of thing. Let's go ahead. So requesting a disclosure, that kind of thing. So there's there's FAQs, there's specific examples. There is there's a page, I think it's called Situations and Solutions Finder. There was one thing I forgot to get in my slides here, but the Jan has a new web page called the Situation and Solutions Finder. And what you do there is you put in your disability. So you can put in 3 pieces of information: disability, accommodations, and the job title. And it will come up with stuff for you. So if you're missing one of the pieces, that's fine. You just put in your disability and your job title, and it will come up with proposed account. So it's kind of nice. You can play with it and manipulate it to get different kinds of information from the system. It's brand new. It's, as far as I know, it's only been out for a month or so. So it's a really new feature. And you just go to askjan.org to find that. And again, it's called the Situations and Solutions Finder. Let me see what else we got going on here.
Oh, and then Robert, I would like to add that I will be providing the slides to all our participants, and the video afterwards as well will be uploaded to YouTube.
Great. Okay, so let's go ahead and have that done, and I will also give my email when we get to that final slide. Thank you very much. So here's some Ask Jan information. Get your phone out. You're going to get the slides. You don't have to copy it, whatever you want to do. But they are really, contact us anyway, basically, is what they're saying. They're very, very good. They've been around since 1983. So they've been doing this for a long, long, long time. So I really encourage you to utilize those resources. Let me go on to, before we answer questions, my email address is robert.wendt. Last name is Wendt. It's on the opening slide. And then the common CSULB.edu. Okay, so
I just put that in the chat for everyone.
Great. Thank you very much. So, copy, paste, do what you got to do. If you are one of our ambassadors, please feel free to email me and I'll send you the QR code. My slide deck that I put it in, I misplaced it. So that's why we're using this slide. I actually had done some work on the other slides to make them more visible for myself. So are there any questions?
I had a quick question. I don't know if I should type it out or.
No, go ahead and speak it. That's fine. That's actually best for me.
Perfect, thank you. First, I just want to thank you for the presentation. It's great information. It's very empowering, and thank you. So my question is, if we say, for example, if we are working in a position where we don't disclose our disabilities, later it comes up, the employers accommodate, but it leaves a bad impression on the employee. And if, for example, the person with the disability who later disclosed their disability needed a letter of recommendation or something from the employer, but the employer wasn't willing to provide it, what would be the best course of action in that situation?
You know, you're not going to really, this is the negative about disclosure. The longer you wait, this is what I mentioned earlier, right? The longer you wait, the more potential for mishaps, right? And then what happens is you don't have any protections. If you performed your job well and you have good performance reviews, right? Then it's reasonable that you should be able to get a letter of recommendation from an employer, or at least them to acknowledge that, hey, if somebody calls me, I'll tell them you did a good job, right? The problem with that is if you don't disclose, and let me get into the weeds here a little bit. If you don't disclose, for instance, and your employer punishes you some way, suspends you for 3 days, whatever, because it's based in your performance that wasn't accommodated, under law, they can do that and you can lose 3 days of pay because you didn't disclose and you weren't protected. So you can't just claim it then and go, oh, I have a, too bad. You should have told us so we could accommodate it. So that's really a fine point I want to put on that. And the case law is really, really, again, I'm not a lawyer, but the case law is really strong on that. I don't think I've ever seen a case. I'm sure there's maybe a case out there, but I don't think I've ever seen a case where somebody won that particular situation.
Thank you.
Okay, so I know I avoided the answer, but you know, a direct answer, but really it's super situational, and that negative impression stuff is hard to come back from. It really is. You know, they say that if you make a bad impression, right, on somebody, it takes 21 more meetings to undo that bad impression. So you want to be careful. Any other questions? Let me see here.
I actually have two, if that's possible.
Yeah.
Should we disclose it on our resume, or is it better to enclose it in the interview? To
I
be
probably,
upfront.
yeah, that's actually a really good question. Some people, okay, so this is a personal choice. There are people that I know that have disabilities and they decide to disclose in their cover letter or their resume, and they do it intentionally because they don't want to be bothered. You either want me or you don't. Okay, so that's a personal choice.
Mhm.
Personally, I wouldn't disclose in the resume because you want them to know why you're qualified, not why you may
Okay.
not be qualified, right?
Okay.
So I would lean to my personal choice is not to disclose anything until I get to the interview. Then
Okay.
I'm kind of trapped and I have to disclose it. But even then, if you have an invisible disability, you don't have to disclose anything. You may
Okay.
want to wait until you've been on the job a week or so to see if there's problems or areas of potential problems, and then make a decision.
And then my next question is, let's say, I think you touched base on this earlier, but I just want more information. Let's say,
Sure.
for a job description, you have the requirements, majority of the requirements for the job description, but due to
Mhm.
your disability, let's say that you're in a wheelchair and there's a particular task that you're unable to do, but you can do majority of it. Does that mean that you can apply for it? Because I know you kind of touched base on it, but I wanted more detail.
Yeah, and it's really based in the employer's kind of acceptance of, and then you going for a lawsuit if they don't, and all, all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
I think if you have a significant majority of the qualifications and you're just asking about restructuring a task or something, as long as the task, the employer's argument's going to be, well, they do this task every day 15 times, right? So that may be
Right.
prohibitive. But if you do the task once every month or something like that, or even once a week for like 10 minutes or 15 minutes, that may be able to be restructured so you can apply. One thing I do want to warn you about qualifications is if you're applying for a government job, they're pretty good about accommodating, but you want to be real careful because oftentimes there's no, like when they're screening people, they really look at the literal specific qualifications identified by the job. So if the job says you have to have this, you usually have to have it when you apply for a government job. But
Okay.
that doesn't mean what you're saying can't be true though.
Okay.
Okay? Does
Yeah.
that answer your question in an obtuse way? This,
Um, sort of.
yeah, this is really situational based on your disability a lot of times, and it's there's no catch-all answers in a lot of this, except I really encourage people to disclose if you think your disability is going to get in the way at some point. It's best to just disclose once you kind of know the lay of the land. Disclose to protect yourself. But that again is a personal choice. Some people do not disclose. I have some WAIV clients that have chosen not to disclose. That's their personal right not to do. They don't want to.
I think in my case, I have to disclose, so I'm trying to figure out how to, like,
Yeah.
because I've
Well,
noticed that when I look at job descriptions, I'm like, I
mhm,
could do this, but there's always like one or two things that are like that I'm not sure if because I can't do this certain task, are they gonna find a way to like
yeah,
not hire me sort of thing?
yeah,
Because I can do majority of it, but there's always
yeah,
this 1 to 2 tasks that kind of gets in the way, so I'm trying to figure it out.
yeah. I think if unless if the task is on top of the list, then it tends to be prominent. So if the task is down that list of ways, you probably got a shot at least taking it, trying. Just realize that some employers are going to come up with possible legitimate reasons why you can't. And you even still have the legal right to go after them if you feel that they could have made the accommodation.
Okay, so either way, I'm allowed to fight if I feel like it's discriminating. Let's.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
Absolutely. You are in a protected class, and if you feel that something's wrong, you have a right to pursue legal remedies if you choose to do so.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. Are there any other questions? And you may ask me offline. You got my email. You're more than welcome to email me. I want to warn everybody though. My day is packed today. My day is packed tomorrow, and I will be off on Friday, so I may not get to you until next week. So just so you know. Now, if people don't show up at certain meetings today and that kind of thing, I will answer you as quickly as I can. But I want to warn everybody what my schedule looks like over the next 2 days. Um, if you have questions that come up even after the fact, that's fine, or something that's kind of related, that's fine. If I don't know the answer, I'll find a referral source for you. I'll do some research and figure out what might be a good place. I think if you look at these, when you have the slides, you will have a lot of information with those links. It will answer tons of your questions. If you still come away from that wanting an answer, you can always go to Jan yourself Or you can go to the Technical Assistance Center. It's called the Pacific ADA Technical. It's up in the San Francisco Bay Area.
I had another question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Let's say if you're applying for a job and you don't initially disclose, and you
Mhm.
wait to get the lay of the land, and later want to disclose, how long of a time window should one wait before disclosing?
It's really based on the need, your need, right? If you feel that there's going to be a problem quickly, then you probably, after a week or two, you may decide, hey, I'm going to disclose, or even after a week, right? You may decide, I better tell, right? If you don't see anything in front of you that's a problem, you can always go try to perform and see what happens, and then look at the difficulties that may or may not present themselves. You may find that you can do it and you don't have to disclose it. If that's your choice, that's your choice. That's okay. That's okay. Again, you just don't have the protections, but it's okay for you to do that. I mean, some of us, even when I was young, even though I had an issue where people could tell there's something going on with my eyes, I never acknowledged it. I just stayed as far away from until I had to read or whatever. I can fake it till I make it. And that's what I did. So, I found over time though that didn't work for me because my vision usually presented a problem someplace along the line. So okay, so anyway, any questions afterwards, please feel free. And I hate to give you that answer, I really do, but it really is super situational. It depends on your disability. It depends on the effects of your disability. It depends on the complexity of the job and what you're capable of doing. Jobs often allow learning curves, so you're allowed to make mistakes until you figure things out often. And if your disability totally prevent you from doing something, obviously you need to say something. But if you're learning and getting better, even though your disability is in the way, you might say, you know what, I think I'm going to let this sit out a little bit and see, or you can ask your employer directly, well, what's the expected learning curve on this task? So that way, oh, it's going to take me twice as long. I better say something. Okay. Okay, folks. Please feel free to contact me. I'll be more than happy to work with you.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to stop the recording now and end the meeting, but yeah, feel free to email either me or Robert anytime. I will have those slides and the recording emailed to you shortly. Okay, bye-bye.